Thank you for coming to this event. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone in attendance at this event may share the views of the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance respect the right of the speaker to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. At the conclusion of the event, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask a question and engage in dialogue. Please be sure to phrase your question in the form of a question, and in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask a single question. Thank you for your attendance.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Mo Elathi.
Good afternoon. My name is Mo Elathi, and I am Executive Director of the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy. And I want to welcome everybody here to the 5th installment in our Exit Interview series. The Exit Interview series is designed to take a deep dive and look at both the policy and political record and eventual legacy of the Obama administration, and to have that conversation with the people that helped shape that record and legacy. So far, we've had conversations with Susan Rice about national security, with Secretary Sylvia Burwell about healthcare reform, with Attorney General Loretta Lynch about social and criminal justice, and just last night with White House Political Director David Seamus talking about the political culture here in Washington. But I don't think it's an overstatement to say that there was really no issue that defined at least the beginning of the Obama administration as much as the economy. Just weeks before the general election in 2008, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the financial crisis, the whole world changed. And with an impending global near depression looming, the new president entered office determined to tackle the global crisis. Tonight, or this afternoon's conversation is going to get into that, how this administration approached it, and what the implications of some of those decisions were, as well as maybe tackle a little bit what lies ahead for the incoming administration. We encourage you to be a part of this conversation, as well as the counterpoint events that we are holding. This series is not designed to be an infomercial for the Obama administration. We do want to make sure all sides are examined, and so for each one of our events, we've been scheduling counterpoint events. The counterpoint for this event will be held on November 30th, where Grover Norquist, the head of Americans for Tax Reform, and a leading conservative voice on the economy, will be coming in to provide his perspective. And stay tuned for some of the other counterpoint announcements for the conversations we have had so far. But please be a part of this conversation. You'll be invited to the microphones on either side at one point to ask your questions, and please engage with us on social media using the hashtag #TheExitInterview. I'd now like to invite up to get the conversation started Spencer Peterson, a joint MBA MPP student at the McCourt School and the McDonough School, who will introduce our participants. Spencer?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Spencer Peterson. I'm a dual degree student in the McDonough School of Business and McCourt School of Public Policy. I first heard about the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service a little over a year ago in an auditorium much like this one. Mo, who you just heard from, was explaining the mission of the newly formed organization during McCourt's graduate student orientation. He explained that the Institute's mission was simply to make politics better. I have to admit, I was a little skeptical at first. It seemed like a pretty lofty goal. To Mo's credit, though, he had a plan. The Institute would tackle this challenge by bringing new ideas and new perspectives into politics, specifically by fostering dialogue between students and professionals. Not just bringing speakers to campus to talk about what politics is and how it works, but having conversations about what it can and should be. These conversations take place on campus with events such as weekly discussion groups led by GU Politics Fellows, as well as off campus with trips such as the Convention Ambassadors Program. This past summer, I was lucky enough to join the GU Politics staff and 9 other students on a trip to Cleveland, Ohio to attend the RNC. It was a phenomenal experience and certainly a highlight of my time at Georgetown thus far. I think we can all agree that we have a ways to go with respect to making politics better, if these last few weeks are any indication. But I've certainly become a believer in the work that GU Politics does in the pursuit of that goal, and would encourage all of you in the audience to get involved if at all possible. With that said, Secretary Jack Lew has been gracious enough to join us today to share his experience as a member of the Obama administration and to reflect on what he sees as successes that we can emulate and challenges that we can learn from. Today's discussion will be moderated by Dean Edward Montgomery, the Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy. Prior to joining McCourt, he served on President Barack Obama's Auto Task Force as Executive Director of the White House Council for Auto Communities and Workers. Dean Montgomery is an economist, and his research has focused on state and local economic growth, wage and pension determination, savings behavior, productivity and economic dynamics, social insurance programs, and unions. Secretary Lew is a fellow Hoya. He graduated from the Georgetown University Law Center. He has a long career of public service, which began in Washington as a legislative aide. He would go on to hold many positions, including as a policy advisor to Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, and as the director of the Office of Management and Budget under both Presidents Clinton and Obama. Following his second tour as the OMB director, he was appointed as President Obama's Chief of Staff, and eventually to his current role as the 76th United States Secretary of the Treasury in 2013. During today's discussion, we ask that you keep your cell phones out and join the fun online using the hashtag #TheExitInterview and follow us at GU Politics. Now please join me in welcoming Secretary Lew and Dean Montgomery.
Well, welcome everybody, and welcome Secretary Lew. I'm glad you could take some time out of your busy schedule to come and talk to us about the Obama legacy as part of this exit interview series. And so we're really pleased to have you to talk about the economy and the economic performance of the administration and what's the legacy, what's the history, how we should remember it. I think we'd like to sort of start from the beginning. You were part of the transition group on the economic team for President-elect Obama in 2008, when we were looking at an economy which was transforming from one of slow growth and starting to head into what became the Great Recession. Housing, number of financial firms were going bankrupt, foreclosures were rising, unemployment was going up. What was the thinking of the team as they prepared their first economic action and how to intervene in the economy and put together what became the Recovery Act?
Well, first, Ed, thanks so much for having me here today. It's good to be back at Georgetown, and I look forward to the conversation. Looking back 8 years, it is almost impossible to exaggerate how scary the economy was during the transition. I spent several months before the election working on what would become a first draft of the Recovery Act. It was, what do you do to turn the economy around? And I've worked on economic response plans in many different contexts. I'd never seen a situation where every day the numbers got worse and worse and worse. At the rate they were getting worse. The size of the hole was getting deeper. The number of people unemployed was getting larger. We, in retrospect, didn't know how deep the hole was because it took several years for the economic statistics to fully correct the numbers. It was simply the worst economic situation in the United States in my lifetime, the worst since the Great Depression. And in fact, the rate of decline in the economy was even greater in terms of the pace of the decline than it was at the start of the Great Depression. So that set the stage for a new president coming into office, and what do you do about it? Decisive action on multiple fronts and used all the tools that you have as a government to address the recession. First, the Recovery Act in size was actually larger than the New Deal. It was targeted not just at the immediate projects that could be funded to put people to work on public works projects, but it was targeted to put money in people's pockets through things like the adjusting tax credits and food stamp levels and business tax adjustments. It was a significant response, I'd say in retrospect, if we had all known what we would later know in terms of the size of the economic decline, probably could have justified economically doing more. I'm not sure that even if you had known the full depth of it, the political environment would have permitted doing more than $800 billion at one time. But not to get out of time sequence, I think it's important to realize that the Recovery Act wasn't the last step. There were additional steps at stimulating the economy through tax cuts, things like the payroll tax holiday that was adopted and then readopted subsequently. And in the end, we put more money into the economy than any other nation in the world did. But we didn't just do that. We stabilized our financial system. And I know that most people look back at that period and look at what did we do just with, say, the financial institutions. But you were working at the time on the auto task force. There was a real question as to whether or not the United States would have an auto industry going forward. There were people who said it was dead. Right. The president's action saved the U.S. auto industry, took what could have been a legacy of the past, and today we have a competitive, vibrant auto industry that is it's healthy and it's competitive around the world. I think that's pretty enormous, both in terms of the kind of jobs that are available and what it says about who we are as a country and what it says about the ongoing competitiveness and ingenuity of the American economy. In terms of the financial sector, stabilizing things quickly required the TARP program, which is something I hope this country never again has to do. It is a profoundly unhappy thing when you have to intervene to prevent the collapse of financial institutions. But at the time, if we had not stabilized the financial institutions, I truly believe we would have not just seen a Great Recession, we would have seen a Great Depression. And we didn't stop at implementing TARP. We followed through and we were repaid the money that we put into that program. And we adopted Wall Street reform and implemented Wall Street reform to make sure that going forward, financial institutions would be better capitalized, more transparent, that we would have tools to resolve them in the future. And you're often asked, have you ended too big to fail? And the only test will come when if we have another crisis. But what I can tell you with absolute certainty is that our financial system is by many times over safer than it was, more resolvable than it was, and in a place where institutions can't take risks that are completely unbounded. And when they do take risks, they have to stand behind them themselves so the American taxpayer won't have to. I think that that's a pretty important accomplishment. You look at where we've come overall. When we took office, we were losing jobs at a rate of 800,000 a month. We've created over 15 million new private sector jobs. There are a lot of things about the American economy that need attention. There are questions about income inequality that we're developing over decades that we still have work to do on. But to compare the economic well-being of any of those 15 million individuals who have families in many cases with jobs to what it would be like if we'd kept losing jobs at 800,000 a month, you can't compare how much better off people are. Now, that's not to say that we don't need to attend to all the other issues, and we've spent the last 8 years addressing many of these issues and made real progress. We need to continue. But I think you have to look at the period when we came in and where we are now and compare before and after. And as I meet with my counterparts from around the world who have had substandard recoveries by any measure, one of the things I say to them is, you need to use all the tools available to you. You need to use fiscal policy. I didn't mention monetary policy. Obviously, the Federal Reserve took a very aggressive role with quantitative easing to use monetary policy. So you need to use fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural reforms to fix the things that are broken. For us, the thing that was broken was, for more than 50 years, we hadn't attended properly to making sure that our financial regulatory system kept pace with the change of the risks that the system presented. Yesterday, I chaired a meeting of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, a body that didn't exist before Wall Street reform. We now sit around a table and we have staff that present to us what are the risks today and what are the risks likely to be in the future. We ask what actions can we take to get ahead of it so we won't be surprised by a crisis in the future. And we have tools within the regulatory agencies to deal with it. I think that's pretty important.
So thinking back on TARP, it's obviously one of the most controversial pieces of legislation, hated by people on the left and people on the right, so maybe that made it an ideal piece of legislation, I guess. But some critics on the left say that TARP and the administration was busy saving the banks and didn't save Main Street. Some people more conservative would say, you over-regulated the banks. You didn't save the banks, and now Dodd-Frank is gone too far, right, between saving banks, punishing those who had done things that caused the Great Recession versus restoring the economy.
I think you have to put yourself back in the position that we all were in 2008 and early 2009, when it wasn't clear where the bottom was. And there was a need for immediate action to stop the economic decline, to make sure that credit didn't just seize up in this country so there was no access to the kind of lifeblood of economic activity. And we had to do it quickly. I think it was done well. You know, I think that we executed it in a way where the taxpayer has come out whole. We've rebuilt an economy that's created jobs. 15 million jobs is a lot of jobs. It's more jobs than, you know, our other countries in the developed world have collectively put out there in the period. So we've done better than other countries. You know, I think that we've done a lot to help homeowners who were hit hard by the recession. You know, it breaks your heart when you hear stories about families that didn't get to stay in their home or never got to put their lives back together. And we have to continue to ask what we can do to rebuild communities and make sure that there's economic opportunity. And we are continuing to focus on that. But I don't think that the answer is, did we do the right thing? We did the right thing because we rebuilt the American economy and we saved it for there to be a future for Americans to become, once again, prosperous. I think you have to look behind the financial crisis. You have to look behind the financial crisis, behind the Great Recession, and look at a trend that had been developing really for 3 decades in terms of stagnant wages and lopsided distributions of both opportunity and income. And those issues were not created by the crisis, but they were exacerbated. And it brought into focus anxieties that are very real. And I think there's a danger when you look at very real issues, you know, like the fact that we don't tax income on capital gains fairly in this country. You know, earned income, you pay a payroll tax, whether you're in $10,000 or $20,000, and maybe you get a tax credit if you're qualifying, but it sure feels like you're paying taxes on every dollar you earn. And then you see that people who are fantastically wealthy, who have appreciated assets, whether it's in stocks or in things that they own, can organize their affairs to never pay taxes on it. It doesn't seem fair. You look around the world, and you know, it is not just in the United States. There is outrage around the world that multinational companies can organize themselves to move from the United States to another country to avoid taxation, and it's wrong. It may be legal, but it's wrong. I think we have to address these kinds of core issues, because if you want to run the kinds of programs that will help deal with the economy of the future, you need to have a vibrant revenue base, and it can't just come from people who are working at, you know, middle-class wages. It has to come, you know, from where the wealth in the country is most, you know, is found. And we have done a lot on that. We have, you know, both by repealing a tax cut at the very top bracket, by having more generous earned income tax credit and child credits, by administrative actions we've taken to try and stop companies from moving offshore to avoid taxation. We've been dealing with it, but there's still a lot of work to be done. If we succeed at that, I think we'll also have the resources to make sure we can invest in infrastructure in this country, can invest in education and training and childcare, and in research and development to make sure that there's a better economic future that can be more broadly shared. Those are the policies we've been pursuing. We've made progress, but there's more work still to be done.
So I think in 2010 you had just moved over back to OMB, and the election came about, but there was the Simpson-Bowles Commission that was talking about a grand bargain, which would have potentially changed some of the tax rules, but also changed and addressed entitlements. That never became legislation. Was there a grand bargain behind the scenes? Was there a deal that could have been had? And if not, or what prevented something from happening on that
So
front?
first of all, Ed, I think we again have to put ourselves back in what the fiscal situation was in 2010. Because we'd seen such a collapse in the economy, our revenues were way down. Because we needed to infuse a lot of spending to get the economy started again, spending was up. We saw the deficits that were staggering. So there was a need to act to bring it under control. And where we are now, the deficit is a little under 3% of GDP. We're on a stable path for the rest of the next 10 years. And obviously policy decisions in the future can change that. I left in 2001 with a surplus, and I came back a few years later, and there wasn't a surplus anymore. So policy makes a difference, but projections show that we're in a stable place right now. I think when you look at the Bowles-Simpson Commission, first I should say Erskine Bowles is a close personal friend. He was chief of staff when I was OMB director. Alan Simpson is somebody that I've known and admired for decades, worked closely with on immigration reform in the 1980s. And I think that they put together a commission report that really brought together a remarkable amount of bipartisan consensus in the context of a commission. But governing and passing legislation and reaching agreements in a commission are not exactly the same thing. We engaged with Congress to try and put together what would have been a grand bargain, dealing with revenues, dealing with discretionary annual appropriations, dealing with entitlement reforms. We got close. But we were never able to get it across the finish line, frankly, because there was not a consensus, particularly in the House Republican caucus, to put together an honorable compromise. I'll get back to this idea of honorable compromise because I think we need as a country to get back to the place where we treat compromise as something honorable, not as something that's a disgrace. And that is, I think, an enormous challenge we have as a country. Where we ended up when the negotiations over a grand bargain were not successful was we ended up doing pieces. And if you look at the elements of whether it was Bowles-Simpson or any of the comprehensive deficit reduction plans, we did an awful lot of the pieces. I don't think we did them in the optimal way. So for example, the first thing we did was we cut annual appropriated spending quite substantially, and then we cut it again through the automatic cuts in sequestration. Now, we did have to curtail discretionary spending, but when you have an economy that's emerging from a deep, deep recession, putting the brakes too fast on annual spending was not the right thing to do. We would have been better off having those cuts come later on and perhaps not be as deep as they were. But nonetheless, we achieved great savings in that area. Second, we saw tax policy that was quite dramatic. It didn't happen right away. It happened a couple of years later, at the end of 2012, the beginning of 2013. But we did eliminate the tax cuts in the highest bracket that produced, as I recall, $700–800 billion of revenue. And over the course of the administration, actually preceding the grand bargain talks in the Affordable Care Act, and then subsequently in other steps that were taken, we've substantially reduced spending on entitlements, particularly in health care. Now, does that mean we've solved all of the long-term entitlement funding issues? No. I, as Secretary of the Treasury, chair the Social Security and Medicare trustees. We put out reports that highlight that more needs to be done. It's not an immediate crisis. We're not on the edge of a disaster, but anyone who's worked in these areas knows that the best way to do it is way in advance before it's a crisis. We also know our political system tends to put off hard decisions until something that's a long-term problem becomes a short-term crisis. So there's more work to be done. But what we have done is we have left a stable foundation where not just for this year, but over the horizon of the next 10 years, there's sound footing in our fiscal policy, and you can go forward now and have conversations about the remaining issues without a sense of crisis, without a deficit that is spiraling out of control, without a debt that's about to become a real inhibitor to economic growth. That again, is going to be subject to policy. In 2001, my last day in office as OMB director, I testified projecting $5.6 trillion of surplus for the next 10 years. Didn't materialize because policy changed. So it makes a difference what the President and Congress does in these areas. But what we're leaving behind is a stable position to build on. And I think to go back to the number I used a few minutes ago, a deficit at 10% of GDP was scary. It was scary because it was going to build the debt up to the point where it would choke everything else we were doing. Having brought that down to just below and projected to be just above 3% of GDP, you have some time. You have some time. And right now, the urgent needs we have in this country are actually areas of spending that have not been adequately addressed in recent years. Things like infrastructure investment. Why do we need to invest in infrastructure? It's not like the days of the Recovery Act where it was to put people to work right away, though it does create good middle-class jobs. It's because we have an economic problem in this country that if we don't build a stronger infrastructure, we won't be competitive in the future. Your roads, your ports, your airports cannot just deteriorate because you neglect them for a generation. So we need to build that. We need to build the right infrastructure. And that's going to compete with fiscal policy, and it has to be done in the right way. I think that today, that is a more immediate concern than the next increment of deficit reduction. Over time, they have to come together, and you have to have a sound fiscal policy along with the investments you need, both in infrastructure and in people, because the most important thing we have in our economy and in our country is our people. And if we don't have people who grow up with the skills you need for the economy of the future, that is a big problem.
So you had mentioned compromise, and in 2012, the president did sign a tax relief that extended much of Bush tax cuts, but did, as you mentioned, get rid of the breaks for the various high tax breaks. That represented a compromise. Are there additional compromises, either that could happen, that you wished might have happened in the tax area of tax policy, on the corporate side, or other areas like that?
Yeah, look, I'm a strong believer that bipartisan, honorable compromise is the way we do great things in this country that have real lasting value. So there are many things that I wish we could have done through that kind of a traditional process of give and take, where everyone gets to say it's an honorable outcome and we've moved the country forward. On the tax side, we came close on business tax reform. We had conversations with senior Democrats and senior Republicans and the administration where the idea of how to deal with business tax reform was converging on something that could have been a consensus. The system wasn't ready to tackle it. I have my own theory as to why, but I think it is sitting out there where there could be a revenue-neutral approach to business tax reform that takes away the pressure that's pushing companies to leave the United States to avoid U.S. taxes, and that in the process will produce one-time revenues that could be used to fund infrastructure. We had the pieces queued up 2 years ago. We've continued to kind of fan the flames since. And if you want to do business tax reform and infrastructure investment in a fiscally responsible way, it's there, and it's something that a bipartisan consensus could be built around. It's not in my area now, but I think comprehensive immigration reform is the other example that I think comes to mind, where I believe there is a majority in Congress that has been prepared to legislate in a responsible way to deal with what I think is both an economic and basic matter of social policy importance. I mean, as in a country, as an economy, we have grown to the strength we have because almost everyone in this room has a parent, a grandparent, or a great-grandparent, or themselves who came from somewhere else. That's been the way America's economy has grown. It's a way you grow your potential GDP. It's a way you keep creativity and innovation in our economy. So the economic case for immigration reform is very strong. Obviously, the politics were very hard. I think that if you look at the kind of missed opportunities of the last 8 years, I see it as not giving Congress a chance to have a majority work its will. I believe there's been a majority in Congress that would have done a lot of the things that need to be done. But I think we've ended up in a place of congressional gridlock because of demands that it be done with a kind of overwhelming support from the party in power. And I remember to a different era when I worked for the Speaker of the House in the 1980s. And it wasn't a popular thing in 1981 when a Republican president was elected and a Democratic speaker allowed a vote on an economic plan that he didn't agree with. And it passed. It passed, and it was something that I found profoundly depressing at the time because it was a program that I didn't agree with. But our system of government worked. A majority worked its will. And 2 years later, there was an election where the balance of power shifted, and it was more of an equal bargaining position. And we saw years of bipartisan compromise come out of that. I don't know how we get back to that kind of letting a majority work its will, but I actually believe you could get a lot done if you just let a majority work its will.
As both Treasury Secretary and at OMB, you've been a key member of the economic team. Part of the economic team in the Obama administration has had to deal with the question of regulation, whether it be climate regulation, whether it be things at the Labor Department to protect overtime, a whole variety of fronts. Describe the philosophy about regulation and when it's good and when it's justified, when it's not, that the administration's taken, that you've taken over the course of the last 8 years.
Well, first of all, our approach to regulation has been to do it very carefully. And if you look at the analyses of the costs and the benefits of regulation, I think we have a stellar record of pursuing regulatory approaches where the benefits way, way, way outweigh the costs. So it is not something we take lightly, and we don't do it in a way that puts burdens out there without seeing benefits that are greater. I think there are different areas of regulatory policy, and some of them are more routine than others. I think what you're focusing on are areas where policies were used to chart new pathways that might have been done by legislation but weren't, as opposed to just implementing rules per specific legislative mandates. I have to say that I think the executive branch has a responsibility to use authorities that are there, but not to overuse them and not to exceed the boundaries. So if the best answer is for Congress to legislate, then hopefully Congress will legislate. But if Congress fails to legislate, then those of us who have executive authority under statutes that exist, I think have an obligation to use it. I spoke a few minutes ago about the actions we've taken at Treasury to try and limit the economic attractiveness of having firms leave the United States to avoid U.S. taxes, even though they keep a lot of their business here, and even though they benefit from U.S. infrastructure and U.S. education and training and U.S. stability and rule of law, but move their address to another country to avoid paying U.S. taxes. Well, I've said many times, I think that's wrong. I think the only way to really address it 100% is through legislation. But I have to tell you, when it became clear that we were not likely to see action in that area, I had to ask myself a question. As Secretary of the Treasury, am I willing to have a record where I looked the other way as I saw the erosion of the U.S. tax base because Congress failed to act when I have tools at my disposal? And the answer was no, I needed to look at those tools and use them. It wasn't easy. It took us a long time to develop approaches that we actually thought would work and that were within our authorities. And I know some people have said, some people accuse us, we dragged our feet. Other people said we were too aggressive. We did it by the book. We had the best tax lawyers and analysts working for years trying to develop within the tools that we had under existing law an approach that would be effective at helping to stem the flow, but not create unintended consequences that would have economic impacts that we would want to avoid. I'm very proud of what we did. I continue to believe Congress should legislate and shut the door and make it so that we have 100% effectiveness at stopping it. But I think the actions we've taken will stand the test of time because they were well thought through, well constructed, and they, I think, get at something that offends the sensibilities of most people.
Yeah, I know as Treasury Secretary, you've played a big role in girding the financial structure internationally, obviously coming out of the financial crisis and then the Euro crisis. International banking has been a concern and the ability of crisis in one country to spread across. As we look at that infrastructure for international commerce, how would you characterize it? What are the big accomplishments? What's the unfinished agenda as far as you see there?
We've been very active in the international space trying to help pull the world up to standards that we already live by. In financial regulatory matters, we have a globally interconnected financial system, and we can take the right steps in the United States, but if there are points of weakness around the world, we're still exposed to risk. So I think it's a good thing that we've used our engagement in the international space to help raise the levels of capital and the levels of oversight around the world. Candidly, I think we have done more than others, and we're safer and sounder than others, but others are much better, and for the next 2 months, while it's still my responsibility, I'm going to push others to do more. I think if you look at our role in terms of economic leadership, since the end of World War II, our global economic leadership has been a source of enormous economic and strategic strength to the United States. Coming out of World War II, there was an environment that wasn't going to prevail forever. The manufacturing capacity of much of the world was destroyed. In order to have money to spend, we had to provide assistance, giving dollars to the world for them to come back and buy American goods. So when people think of the economy of the 1950s, in the 1960s, you have to remember that in historical context, it was the post-war period where the U.S. rebuilt the global economy. If you look at the system of the architecture of the global economic system, it has been the most effective way of lifting people out of poverty in the history of public policy. We have hundreds of millions, billions of people lifted out of poverty because we have helped to shape a better economic system in the world. Does that mean we have a perfect world? No, we've got problems in a lot of the world. Those problems wouldn't be better with another billion people living under poverty. And instability would not be reduced if we had a world where everyone was isolated, just living within their own economic systems. That doesn't mean we can be vulnerable or should allow ourselves to be vulnerable to unfair practices. One of the major areas of activity that I've been engaged in and my predecessors were engaged in has been to defend the rights of U.S. companies not to be hurt by unfair competition, to fight policies in other countries that we thought were unfair in terms of gaining advantage through exchange rate practices that were inconsistent with competitive market terms. We've made a lot of progress. At the most recent international meetings, we've had the nations of the world agree with us that it was unacceptable for countries to intervene in currency markets to gain unfair advantage, that it was necessary to use all the policy tools to get an economy moving so it's not excessive reliance just on one lever. I think we've made a lot of progress in the international space, but when you look at the strategic side of it, our leadership in something like the International Monetary Fund, not a household word, but I've spent much of the last 4 years fighting to make sure that we kept our word and paid our bills at the IMF. Our ability to intervene in a situation like stabilizing Ukraine's economy, we've done through the IMF. We've done some bilateral things, but the vast majority we've done by pressing that in the IMF. The first response to the Ebola outbreak was work we did with the IMF to provide fiscal relief to countries that didn't have any money to deal with anything because Ebola came crashing down on them. I can give you many examples where our ability to be a leader in the world has been expressed through our involvement in the international institutions that we built at the end of World War II. So we're not going to go back to a day when the only functioning economy in the world was the United States. I hope that was not it was a bad thing to have to fight World War II because we had to defeat evil, and in doing so, we left a world that was very much in wreckage. Hopefully we'll have a world with healthy competitors who compete on fair terms, and we'll hold them accountable to standards that meet our standards, not the standards that others impose. So I'm a big believer in the system. I think we've done a pretty lousy job explaining it to people. They look at these institutions and don't understand them because they're not kitchen table conversations. But I do know that if you look, say, at the auto industry, the fact that we export auto parts creates a lot of jobs in the United States. And even if some of those cars are assembled out of the United States, I want those jobs in the United States creating the parts.
So, obviously, one of the themes in the election was where's the United States' role with our neighbors and trade and globalization. The Brexit vote in England, Great Britain, brought into question their role in the global economy. I think there's a fear in many countries about, what's this globalization doing to middle class? As you look over the Obama administration and your own record, what are sort of some of the accomplishments in this global context you think the administration has made, and is there any unfinished agenda as far as you?
Look, I think this issue of inequality is a pressing issue in the United States and around the world, and it has been for some time. We have, in the course of the Obama administration, continuously tried to address this issue even when it wasn't a dominant political theme. So, for example, I mentioned in the Recovery Act, one of the things we did was to make more generous the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Credit. Several years later, we made that permanent so that it wasn't just a one-time short-term benefit to working families. It became a permanent feature of our tax policy. We've done many things along those lines, but obviously we haven't done enough. When I say we, I don't just mean the United States. I think it's global. I mean, you look at the Brexit vote, the people of the United Kingdom voted for a policy that is almost certainly going to reduce the size of the economy of the United Kingdom. And that's not because people want a smaller economy. It's because they fundamentally don't believe that they get the benefit from a growing economy. So we have to not just win the argument at a macro level. So when we argue, as I think we correctly do, that a trade agreement like the Trans-Pacific Agreement will grow the U.S. economy, we also have to show how that benefit is going to flow to working families. And we have to attend to that not just at the time an agreement is penned, but during the periods in between. I have to tell you that I've gone to many international economic meetings, and in the last year, I've heard more discussion about inclusive growth than in all the other years combined. So this issue is something that we've been pressing, and I'm glad it's on the agenda, but we now have to follow through and act on it. I'm proud of the record we have in the Obama administration at both identifying the issue and dealing with important aspects of it, but I think that the anxiety that lies behind the concerns that are expressed about things like globalization are not just about trade agreements. It's about technology. It's about the changing structure of the economy. It's about the relative importance of labor and capital in the modern economy. They're very fundamental issues of economic structure, and I think that if we care as much as I do about liberal democracy and free market capitalism, we have to make it clear that we're willing and able to pursue policies that allow the benefits of economic growth to be broadly shared.
I think we'd like to turn the questioning over to students in the audience. I think there'll be microphones in the aisles, and so come down, identify yourself as we ask the question, as people are lining up. But let me ask you this one. You've spent your whole career in public service. You've held high positions in Treasury, OMB, State Department, on the Hill. What's your personal legacy as you look back? How would you like to be remembered?
You know, Ed, I've spent over 4 decades, 25 years in public service, and I can't go to any part of the United States, or frankly to very many places in the world where I can't see real positive impact that's come from things I've had a hand in. And I think that if you are privileged to have the ability to make our country a better place and our world a better place, that is something that you can be pretty proud of. And I encourage, whether it's students at the McCourt School or students more broadly, to think about public service as the best opportunity to improve the lives of people both in your country and around the world. Not necessarily people who will know you, who will thank you for what you did, but where you can affect policy. It's called public policy for a reason. I spoke at the McCourt graduation a few years ago about this. It's public because it affects everyone. And it's just a true privilege to have the opportunity, with rising responsibility, to make an impact on that. Whether it's Social Security reform or helping to be part of the economic recovery over these last 8 years, or rebuilding U.S. ties throughout the world, I look back at my career as something that's just been a privilege.
So we'll start on this side.
Excellent. Thank you for coming, Mr. Secretary. My name is Spencer. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service. You mentioned at some point business tax reform and as well corporate tax inversions. And I wanted to press upon this issue of international tax policy. Furthermore, what your thoughts are on whether we should adopt a territorial system or do a tax repatriation holiday or that tax repatriation holiday infrastructure swap. And if we do choose to do the latter, as it seems to be you were suggesting at some point, how do we ensure that those funds go to funding repairs to existing infrastructure rather than going to funding new public works?
So, first of all, I think that we have a real challenge in the United States and around the world to address both the things about our system that pushes companies away and also the things about some of the other systems that is a magnet that pulls them in. So we have the highest statutory corporate tax rate in the developed world. And we have to fix that by closing loopholes and by imposing a mandatory tax on U.S. income that doesn't come home. Other countries have to address it by getting out of the business of the race to the bottom, lowering their tax rates to say, you'll pay less taxes if you come here. So having our policy become a better policy for the United States has to be married with working internationally to have more of a norm develop. We have proposed, and I think there's broad bipartisan agreement, that having a tax on U.S. income overseas ought to not be a voluntary thing. If you bring it home, you pay. If you don't bring it home, you don't pay. We've actually proposed that there be a one-time tax on all of the stranded income that's overseas now, and that would generate one-time revenues that are substantial, depending on where you set the rate. We believe you could get several $100 billion of revenue, depending on where the rate is, which we've proposed should go into infrastructure investment. I'm not sure that the standard should be fixing old versus new. I actually might disagree with you. I think if you had a way of encouraging some of the new infrastructure that you need, it would be a good thing. So I think the issue isn't old, new. If you've got a broken highway and people are spending 2 hours in traffic to go on a 30-minute drive, you need to fix that road, both to give people their lives back. People get pretty anxious sitting in a car for 2 hours instead of 30 minutes, and to reduce the pollution and the inefficiency that comes from that. So repairs are certainly part of it. But we also need to build mass transit. We need to have ports that are deep enough to take the deep draft vessels that are now going to go through the Panama Canal, and to have airports where people can get to and from their connections in a way that doesn't make travel so difficult, not to mention cargo. So I don't think it's new old, I think it's sensible. We need to target infrastructure investment to where it's of real strategic value. In some cases that will be repair, in other cases it'll be new construction. We've proposed that an infrastructure bank should supplement direct federal investment in infrastructure to get leverage to try and drive resources towards strategic projects. And we've also promoted public-private partnerships because when you look at the infrastructure needs we have in this country, they're never going to be met entirely by public funds. Having a kind of three-part approach like that, I think, would make more than a dent. It would make a real contribution to getting us on the right track, so to speak.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Dan Gaudreau. I'm an MBA student at the McDonough School of Business. Thank you for being here today. So my question is, a recent Wall Street Journal article suggests that President-elect Trump in office would aim to dismantle the Dodd-Frank Act. In your opinion, what are the most important aspects of Dodd-Frank and would yield the biggest consequences if dismantled?
Well, I'm not going to address any of the potential future policies of a new administration, but I've spent much of the last 4 years defending Dodd-Frank against many efforts in Congress to repeal it. And the argument that I've made is when you look at the financial crisis that caused the Great Recession, we know what was at the root of much of it. We had too much risk, we had insufficient capital, we had inadequate resolution mechanisms, and in the end, we had a system that was essential to our economic well-being, but so fragile that it needed to be propped up in order to survive. Dodd-Frank changed all of those things. It has given us the transparency so that you can now know what's in the complex financial products that are being bought and sold. We have capital levels that have been many times over increased so that we have better capitalized financial institutions, which means they can bear their own risk. And we have resolution mechanisms where there is both a process and a specific set of practices that have been laid out in the form of living wills for the largest institutions so that we know what you would do if a major institution hit trouble. I think we're not just a little bit safer because of that. We were enormously safer because of it, and I think it's one of the things that has made the U.S. economy more resilient than other economies in the world because we've done more on each of those scores. The day after the Brexit vote, when there was a lot of volatility in markets, nobody was complaining that our financial institutions were well capitalized and that we were all very comfortable that they could handle whatever came at them. You don't get to choose what is going to be the event that causes potential distress. It can be a natural disaster, it can be policies, it can be any of a number of things. It can be an economic cycle. But you know that if your financial systems are well capitalized, if you know what's going on in them, and you can work out problems when they develop, that you're a lot better off than you were before. And I think that's a legacy. You know, we had a meeting yesterday of the Financial Stability Oversight Council I mentioned a few minutes ago. That group of people didn't sit around a table and have those kinds of conversations 8 years ago. It was nobody's job to say what are the risks to financial stability. Everybody regulated a little piece of the financial system, but bringing it all together and asking the question, is there a financial stability risk, is the responsibility that was created out of Dodd-Frank in the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which I chair. I think that that is a legacy that is not just important for today, it's important going forward.
Thank you.
So I'm also an MBA student, but given the preface you gave to that answer to Dan's question, I don't know if you can answer this, but I had no idea until I came to Georgetown how absurdly complicated the financial markets really are. And to me, having industry experience would be, not just a benefit, but almost necessary. So I was wondering if you could talk about, when looking at your successor, the pros and cons of, the Warren Doctrine on one side, absolutely no industry revolving door, first kind of the way extreme on the other side, and Trump potentially bringing in, Goldman Sachs to run Treasury.
Look, I think that the job of overseeing the economic and financial policy of the United States is enormously important and complicated. There are a lot of different backgrounds that you have to draw upon in order to do the job well, and probably no individual comes with all of the skills that you have to develop while you're doing it. Somebody might know markets better, somebody else might know Congress better, somebody else might know economic policy better. Somebody else might have more international experience. You're in a role where you need to become proficient in all of those things. I think it's a mistake to just label any group with a broad brushstroke. And I think you have to look at each individual, and you need individuals of personal integrity, of personal ability, hopefully with a varied background, because you're doing many different things. So I for one, have tried to make sure we have balance at the Treasury Department with people who come from many different backgrounds, so that it's not one perspective that I'm getting advice from. Ultimately, it does come up to the top of an organization to make the hardest decisions, and you need somebody who's knowledgeable, you need somebody who's fair-minded. To me, the challenge is somebody going to avail themselves of the facts? Will they go through rigorous analysis? And will they withhold political judgment until they've had a chance to do that analysis in order to come to the best conclusion that you can? I have learned that it is often not the case that the thing that you think going into a complicated policy decision is the same as the thing you think after you've kind of rolled up your sleeves and gone through the hard work of figuring out what the both intended and unintended consequences of different pathways forward is. What I do know is the consequences of getting it right are very consequential, very consequential. And we should want people, as I say, with the highest integrity and the best background to do that. And that's going to come from a lot of different places.
Hi, my name is Henry. I'm an MBA student here, and I actually work part-time at the OCC, so you're technically my boss.
You're the first person at the OCC to ever say that to me.
We're part of Treasury. We really are.
Proud of its independence, then.
I have a two-part question. The first is on countering the financing of terrorism.
Yeah.
I wonder why it's been such a challenge fighting the Islamic State's financing networks, and specifically, what lessons learned could you give to the next administration about fighting the underground Hawala networks or the use of digital currencies by ISIS? And secondly, following the revelations in the Panama Papers, what more can the U.S. do to fight offshore tax evasion? I know there was a rule by FinCEN this year on customer due diligence, and we had FATCA a few years ago, but is there anything else you think we could be doing to fight tax evasion?
Well, first, on the question of countering the financing of terrorism, we have made enormous progress, both using the tools that we have and developing relationships across the government, including with intelligence and military partners where necessary. You look at the ISIL ability to raise money. What they did at the beginning was they conquered territories and they emptied out the bank vaults, and they had cash that they could spend for a while. They then seized oil fields and distribution networks, and they had a renewable source of funding. Well, we have done a lot working with the government of Iraq to stop the flow of money into areas under ISIL control, with the military to target centers where both money was stored and where there was the ability to create new revenue. And we basically shut down the global financial system to ISIL. At the end of last year, I chaired a UN Security Council meeting. It was during the US presidency. It was the first time in the history of the United Nations that finance ministers met at the UN, at the Security Council, and we met to unanimously approve a resolution that will treat ISIL the way Al-Qaeda was treated and bring all the countries of the world into working together to try to stop those flows. So I don't think we can say that we've gotten to the point of ultimate success, because ISIL is a tough opponent. As they lose geographical coverage, they don't need as much money to keep doing what they're doing. And a lot of the things that they do to create terror in cities around the world isn't very expensive. So you don't need to have the same vast resources that you have when you control what's equivalent to a nation in terms of geographical presence. We are going to continue to work as hard as we can to close down both formal and informal access, but I think we also have to understand that they will continue to have access to some resources, which is very dangerous, and we have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to keep that access as difficult as possible. On the question of the Panama Papers and the issues arising out of it, first of all, you mentioned FATCA. It's a U.S. statute that provides the sharing of tax information so the tax authorities and law enforcement authorities around the world can see when people are avoiding taxes. FATCA went from being an acronym to being an international word. People pronounce it FATCA or FETCA, but everyone talks about it as the standard. So we should be very proud that we passed legislation that's now the world standard. We actually have to pass more legislation for the U.S. to fully participate in exchanging tax information. We have asked for that. We hope Congress will act to provide that authority. On the question of who owns either an account or an asset, beneficial ownership is often very hard to see. One of the things that came out in the Panama Papers was documentation that showed who was really the owner of different assets. Our view is that law enforcement authorities and tax authorities should be able to share information about that. The rule that we took, the administrative action we took, addresses when you open a bank account, having visibility into who the true beneficial owner is. It was very important. We don't have the authority to do that whenever a corporation is formed. That has to be done by legislation. We have proposed legislation to do that. And again, it's an area that I hope Congress legislates in. So yes, there's more we could do, but I think we can be proud of the steps we've taken, and I don't think we should rest until we make more progress.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a freshman in the college, and I'm very interested in international political economics. So since the pivot to Asia-Pacific region is a very crucial proposal in the Obama administration, so I'm thinking under the condition that Mr. Trump is pretty anti-trade, if we want to continue this pivot regarding both trade and security, how will we continue in the next administration?
So again, I'm not going to comment on the specific policies of the next administration. I don't think it's a secret that our administration has pursued a policy of deep engagement around the world and have pursued trade agreements. First of all, our engagement around the world helps to raise standards, whether it's in major economies that we have very deep relationships with, like China, or just broadly when we have a group of countries that's meeting on something like a trade negotiation. We're the country that drives free market standards. We're the country that drives strong labor practices. We're the country that drives high environmental standards, and we're the country that drives pushing corruption out. Whether we do that in a bilateral setting or in a multilateral setting, the world's a better place, the United States is a better place when we are pushing our values through the global economy. I hope the United States continues to play the world leadership role that it's played on economic matters. I think we have a lot to show for it in terms of having improved the U.S. economy and our security. I also think if you look around the world, we have a world that is a lot safer and a lot stronger than it otherwise would be. But we can't shy away from standing behind our values. When we see countries that are doing things that are wrong, we have to stand up to it. We have to take actions to use our trade laws to enforce remedies. We have to use the power we have as the leading economy and the strongest country in the world to have countries want to meet the standards that we advocate. I don't think you can accomplish that without engagement. We've tried, and I think we've been very successful in our engagement over these last 8 years to both strengthen the U.S. economy and spread U.S. values more broadly, and to build a foundation for both economic and strategic cooperation on that.
My name is Alec. I'm a freshman in the college. My question also has to do with trade. During the campaign, trade got a lot of flack for causing outsourcing, particularly NAFTA. But many analysts argue that it just looks like jobs are being outsourced when really we've seen the simultaneous rise of automation, which also contributes to loss of jobs. So how much do you think each of those factors plays into outsourcing and job loss? And secondly, what are the prospects of, taking the jobs back that have theoretically gone to Mexico or other countries as a result of free trade agreements like NAFTA?
I think if you look at the facts of the benefits we get from trade agreements, it actually makes a pretty strong case for the trade agreements. Even in the U.S.-Mexico example, there's roughly 1 million jobs in the United States that are being supported by trade because of the things we sell to Mexico. The argument for a trade agreement can't just be that we grow the economy overall. I think that is actually not that difficult an argument to win because you can show the macroeconomic benefits of trade in a pretty straightforward way. Where we've had a challenge, and frankly where I don't think we've been as effective as we need to be, is making both the policy and the case that that benefit spreads through the economy in a way that people can feel. When you look at any American household and ask, what is the standard of living? Is it better or worse because of trade? It will, I think, for most households, the overwhelming number of households, be better, whether it's because it leads to more affordable products or because it's led to the job that is supporting the income of that family. We know that a job that is related to trade has higher wages than a job that isn't related to trade. And we know that the growing demand around the world is not ultimately in the United States with our population that is not growing as fast as it once did and is just not as big as the rest of the world. It's in areas that we want to be able to compete in. We want to be able to sell U.S. goods and services in. And we certainly don't want other countries to write the standards in those countries so that our concerns about things like environmental standards, labor standards, fair business practices, rule of law become, well, you don't have to worry about that anymore. That's pretty central to how we spread things that are important to us around the world. Have we done a good job communicating it? Obviously, not as much as we need to. But you, in your question, put your finger on something that I think is very hard to separate, but it is very important. I can't give you a number how much of the anxiety people have is related to technology and how much is related to trade. I think they're kind of combined when people think of what does the economy of today and the economy of the future look like. What I know is you can't turn back the clock. In the 19th century, Luddites couldn't stop the introduction of machines to do what people did in factories. We're not going to remove, nor should we want to remove, technology that makes it possible to produce things more efficiently, more cheaply, more with less environmental impact. The question is, what are we doing to make sure that we have an economy where everyone can have an opportunity to have a good job and a middle-class income? Some of that is about education and training. We have roughly 3 to 4 million jobs in this country that are open and roughly 3 to 4 million people looking for work. And if you could match people up, it would feel like a much better economy. But that's not going to work in every case. It's not going to be that everyone who either did or wants to work in a factory is going to have exactly the skills to go and work in the technology sector. We're going to have to mediate a transition with whether it's things like trade adjustment assistance or other ways that we equalize opportunity in the economy. The fact that our tax system has not kept pace with the change in the structure of our economy, I think, is of fundamental importance. The fact that we're not taxing the gains of the modern economy as we should is both a source of real unfairness and the perception of it not being on the level, and it deprives us of the resources to do the things we need to do to make sure that people have the skills and the resources to succeed in the economy of the future. We've made proposals to deal with that. I'm not going to go through the technical details of them. I hope that that's something that the political debate embraces and doesn't just treat it as if it's all one thing. It's not all globalization. It's not all trade. It is the combination of technology. The world is different. The structure of our economy is different. Our policies have to keep up with it. I do not believe that the United States will be either richer or stronger if we kind of isolate ourselves economically. I do think we have an obligation to make sure that we are always a country that worries about how does everyone have an opportunity to succeed.
Thank you.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes. So if we could do the questions quickly, we'll try and get you both in.
Thank you, Dean Montgomery and Secretary Liu. My name's Dan. I'm a public policy student from here and also in Singapore. I wanted to understand how your understanding of economics has changed, particularly in light of the global financial crisis. And some economists have sort of said that the 30 years of macroeconomics in the lead up to the crisis was, at worst, spectacularly harmful, and whether or not the things that happened in the global financial crisis have led to your understanding shifting, and how did that happen?
Look, I think that the fact that we had a financial oversight system that was out of date and inadequate to the challenges of a late 20th, early 21st century financial system was not apparent before the global financial crisis. But when you think about it, you think about what the world looked like in the 1930s when many of our laws were written and what the world looks like today. In retrospect, it should have been. You know, when no one knew what a derivative was in 1936. It wasn't, I mean, you had savings accounts, you had mortgages, you had loans. It was a much simpler structure. I'm oversimplifying it, but not by that much. We had gotten into abstract financial products that were being repackaged and bought and sold in ways that individuals, institutions, and regulators didn't know what was inside the walls of a financial institution. And so when you had an institution collapse, the first source of panic was you couldn't see where it would reach. You couldn't see what the knock-on effects were going to be, which leads you to fear the worst, which then leads to a run risk that's very substantial in other institutions. I think we've addressed that very substantially through the steps we've taken. I actually think the danger sitting here today, 10-ish years after the beginning of the financial crisis, is complacency. It's to think that we got it right in 2009 and we can take another 50 years before we look at it again. Change happens faster than that. It happens daily, it happens weekly, it happens monthly. We cannot sit here today and answer the question, what are going to be the risks 12 months or 24 months from now, because the world won't look the same. We have to make sure that we retain the vigilance and the focus on asking those questions, not jumping to the solution that everything should be overregulated, but asking, are there threats that need to be addressed? And frankly, I think one of the lasting lessons coming out of the financial crisis is that those with responsibility for overseeing financial stability have to take it seriously going forward as how do we see what's coming, not just what happened in the past. Because otherwise, we'll let our guard down and some other bubble will develop, some other exposure will develop, and people will say, how could they let that happen? Well, avoiding complacency, staying on top of it, I think is critically important. We've done quite a lot. I think we can be proud of what we've done 2008 to now. Going forward, we can't say job done, let's move on.
So I hate, you've been waiting very patiently.
Yeah.
If
I can take one more.
prevail on you for one
Yeah.
more question.
My name is Josephine Moore. I'm a second-year student in the Masters of Foreign Service program. I was just wondering, we're seeing an aging demographic across the developed world. We're seeing low to negative interest rates, and at the same time, we have more and more pensions that are unfunded. And moving forward in this environment, they've lost the necessary interest that they had to gain to make that up. So they've been having to make more and more returns up in the future. How do we deal with that? How do we go into that aging demographic?
Look, I think demographic changes have been very real in the United States and in much of the developed world. The baby boom was a reality. My generation was a very large generation. It was large growing the economy when we came of age, and when we retire, it's going to be a very large retired population. I think that making sure we have a sound fiscal policy and that we can keep our commitments to generations, present, past, and future, is part of it. Because we don't, I think, have the ability to say, well, this is a big surprise that we now have a lot of retirees. We knew it was coming, and we have to manage our fiscal policy to make sure we can keep our commitments. Interest rates, low interest rates have multiple different ways of influencing the economy. Central banks around the world have been pursuing policies of low interest rates to generate more economic activity. The better the economy is doing, the more your macroeconomic growth will help to provide both for the public and private resources you need to meet the needs of an economy. In the United States, we have both public and private challenges in pension funding. I think the public challenges are, at a federal level, are manageable. It does require some more attention because roughly 20 years from now, there will be challenges in Social Security financing, but that's a reason to deal with it now, not wait for 15 years to deal with it. But it's not a reason to dismantle our income security program. Social Security, which was created in the 1930s, came close to ending poverty amongst the elderly when, if I remember correctly, it was like 80% before. I mean, it's one of the most important things we've done to make this a better country. The answer is, how do you make sure it's sound? I mean, I was privileged in 1983 to work on bipartisan Social Security reform, and if that, from 1983 to roughly 20 years from now, keeps the Social Security system sound, I would say that was a good day's work that we went over 50 years. It doesn't mean the job is done. You got to stay on top of it. Private savings are obviously producing low yields in a low interest rate environment. That creates risks that that there's a rush, a search for yield that puts investments into riskier assets. You always have to balance risk with return, and one of the dangers is if the only focus becomes pure return, you might end up with more risk. We have to pursue economic growth in this country. If we get back, as I believe we are on a path to, a more normal rate of growth, then it's up to monetary policy officials to decide when you let interest rates start to rise. I think all the projections that we do, all the projections that private forecasters do, show that interest rates will tick up over the next 10 years. I think it's a mistake to think about interest rates from just one perspective. If there had not been low interest rates, along with the fiscal policies that we enacted, along with the structural reforms that we enacted, we wouldn't be seeing the core rate of macroeconomic performance, and the problem could be worse, not better, from the perspective that you're asking about. So while I can't question that low interest rates create real challenges in matching obligations and returns, the absence of low interest rates also would have created challenges as well. And whether it's at the public or private level, it requires careful stewardship, good investment practices, and in the case of public policy, sensible approaches to dealing with what are kind of arithmetically knowable challenges in the decades ahead.
So Secretary Liu, I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and really enjoyed the opportunity to hear from you about the economic record of the Obama administration, its legacy. On the 30th of November, we will have an alternate perspective on the Obama record from Grover Norquist. I encourage people to attend both of those events, but I really want to take this moment to thank you for coming and sharing it, and ask everybody to join me in thanking Secretary Liu.
Thank you, Ed.